All right, so it looks like I have to rebuild the speedometer as well on this Lexus LS400, and this is the last straw. I think I have to change my mind about these rolling pieces of crap. Hey, how's it going, do-it-yourselfers? That's right, I'm having a bit of a change of heart about these sedans. Now, I know in the past I've said that these are some of the most reliable luxury sedans ever made, and that still holds true about the engine, the internal parts of the engine, and possibly the transmission if it's serviced on time and correctly. But the problem is, it's all the other things that are falling apart on these cars. Mainly the electronics that are sometimes hard to diagnose and also expensive to replace, but it's not limited to those. There's also other parts that are really hard to get to and expensive to replace, and we'll go over them in this video, and then you can make up your own mind whether you agree with me or not. All right, so first up, a bad ECU that we diagnosed in the previous video that doesn't put enough voltage to our throttle position sensor. So yeah, this is a very common problem with the ECUs on these cars. The capacitors go bad, they start leaking, and then they don't provide enough voltage to the different sensors and components. In this case, it's the throttle position sensor, and this caused hesitation around the 2000 RPM. The problem with this is the person doing the diagnosis needs to have a good head on their shoulders, needs to know what they're doing. Otherwise, they're gonna cost you money by just throwing parts at your car and not, being able to properly diagnose and replace the ECU. The other problem is it's the ECU. The ECU is an expensive part to replace. And this, what I did was I replaced the capacitors, and then I put the ECU back in the car. It actually got better. We were getting 10.5 volts when the ECU was bad, and then once I replaced the capacitors, I was getting about 11 something volts, and it was good for a while. But then again, eventually, after a few trips, it started doing the same thing again. So what I had to do was to get a rebuilt ECU on eBay for 450 bucks, throw that in there, and now we're getting 11.5 volts with the engine off and 13.5 volts with the engine running. So yeah, there's that. But next up, it's the cluster on these cars that goes bad. To be specific, it's the backlighting. It starts flickering on and off once it goes bad, and it's very annoying, and you really have to fix it. And you want to guess what causes that? Yep, you guessed it, bad capacitors. Mainly, I think these three on this board, but not 100%. I'm going to go ahead and replace as many of the capacitors as I can, and hopefully that will fix the problem. If not, to get a used cluster. The problem with that is the mileage carries over with the used cluster. So if you're in a boat like me where you have a 93 Lexus LS400 with relatively low miles, this thing has 110,000 miles, I go and get a used cluster for 100 bucks out of the junkyard or whatever, the odds are that cluster is going to have 200,000 miles on it. Your other option is to send in your cluster to be rebuilt by a professional. Again, you can find, the one I could find on eBay was 300 bucks. You send it, 300 bucks plus shipping, you get a rebuilt cluster. That hopefully will fix your problem. Your other option is, again, buy a used cluster and send that again to someone on eBay, and they'll reprogram and match the mileage on that used cluster to your cluster. Now that's good. It's going to cost a little bit less than 300 probably. But the problem is that used cluster can go bad again and you're back to square one. So what I'm going to do is to give it a go at this myself. If it works out, great. If not, I'll ship it to eBay, have someone rebuild it for me. Now luckily removing it is not a barrier. It's only like 4 or 5 screws, one bracket by the ignition, and it comes out with some gentle persuasions, let's say. All right, so next up, more backlighting issues. This time, well actually it's 3 components, but we'll lump them all together for the sake of our sanity. We're talking about the radio, the HVAC control, and also our gear selector backlighting. All right, now I just turned off the shop light, but still we're getting some sunlight into here, so maybe you can't tell exactly how bad it is. As you can see, the displays come on, but the backlighting for all the buttons is not on. You can just see the white writing on the buttons, of course, but also there's the gear selector. No backlighting there either. Now, this doesn't look too bad again on this camera because there's daylight here, but at night when you're driving, this is just pitch black. You can't see any of the buttons. You can't, do any change the radio station. You can't do the controls on the HVAC. Very frustrating. Now, you guys want to guess what causes that backlighting problem on those components? If you said capacitors, you're wrong. It's bad transistors this time. Way to go, Toyota. You picked the right components to skimp out on. Now that's sadly true because Toyota did not skimp out on any of the rubber parts, like all the hoses, all the belts, their drive belt, the factory timing belts, anything to do with the vacuum lines. They're all fantastic quality. They're really high quality. They last a really long time. And this should really go without saying. I wish they skimped out on the quality of the rubber hoses. Like this upper radiator hose takes about 5 minutes to replace instead of the transistors and capacitors. Even their timing belt, even if they skimped out on the quality of the timing belt, which lasts like a crazy amount of time, 150,000 miles or so. If they skimped out on that, even if it breaks, it's not going to damage the engine because the engine is non-interference. All right, next up, let's touch upon a couple of mechanical components that goes bad on these cars that are bare to replace. So first up, your starter. If the starter on these cars ever goes bad, and it does, just like any other car, it is buried right down here, right below this intake manifold. So in order to replace that, you're going to have to completely remove the intake manifold. Think triple or quadruple the man hours required to replace this starter when comparing it to your average vehicle. Basically, you're going to have to fork out a lot of money to simply replace a starter. Now, besides that, another common problem is the power steering pump on these cars goes bad. Not a huge deal, not super hard to replace. The problem is it leaks onto the alternator, which is right below it. It will damage that, and then that has to be also replaced usually. Now, there's another minor problem with these power steering pumps, which is minor in cost and replacement, but potentially could cost you a lot of grief if someone, let's say, misdiagnoses this. And that is, these power steering pumps have an air control valve. And this air control valve is connected to your intake manifold. And when it goes bad, it kind of allows the power steering fluid to be sucked into the intake manifold because there's vacuum there, and your engine will start burning power steering fluid. Now, some people can misdiagnose this as the engine burning engine oil because this is not a very common problem, and then they could condemn your engine. Now, hopefully not, but I can see this happening from time to time. Now, besides that, there's also an EGR pipe which is buried right there. You can see it probably right all the way down there. That likes to crack, and as you can see, that's also another hard to reach place, which again will cost you money to replace. And this is a very common problem. So besides those, there's also the rack and pinion that also seems to fail a lot on these cars. It's kind of a bear to get to as well. It's not super bad, but again, something you want to keep in mind. And also, one note on the timing belt is that yes, these are non-interference engine. That is the 90s to 94 Lexus LS400s. The 95 and 96, they are interference, so you want to keep that in mind. But the timing belt job on these is a bit more involved than, other, let's say, V8 engines. So yeah, even though it's not interference, you still have to replace it because if it ever breaks, it's going to leave you stranded somewhere. When I did a timing belt replacement on my C5 Audi way back, which had the 2.7 liter, I had to pull this entire front clip out to get to the timing belts, and everybody went crazy in the comment section. And this is not as bad as that, but it's not far off either. So keep that in mind. The labor cost on replacing the timing belt and water pump on these is not going to be super cheap. So yeah, it turns out Toyota also makes pieces of crap. Now, I'm kidding, of course. This is still a reliable car, but is it the most reliable luxury car ever made? No, not in my opinion. You simply can't have your control module and other electronic components in your car, like your cluster, your radio, your AC controls, keep failing due to bad capacitors or bad transistors. Doesn't matter if they choose the wrong manufacturer. Whatever the reason is, you just can't have that and be labeled the most reliable luxury car ever made. That's right, we're taking that title back from you. Now, mind you, this car only has 110,000 miles on it. It is 30 years old, and it has always been in Southern California, where it's a bit warmer. Maybe the heat has something to do with it, but in my opinion, that's still not a good enough excuse. This simply shouldn't happen. But hey, that's just my opinion, and what do I know? But anyway, leave a comment down below and let me know what you guys think. And make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more like it. And also check out these other videos on this side of the screen, also in the suggestion box. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.